That's the unity I want to see in this House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
To resume debate. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Madam Speaker, I'll split my time with the member for Saskatoon-Grasswood. Today, I must oppose the Prime Minister's unjustified and draconian invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canada. Like so many watching from home in Lakeland, I'm struggling with the events of the last 2 days. Seared in my mind are images of fellow Canadians literally and metaphorically trampled, pushed back, struck down, driven out, and away by the might, scope, and scale of the unrestrained power of the state. Like many colleagues here, I've lived, worked, and walked in the downtown Ottawa core for the past 3 weeks, and my truth is this: the most violence, obstruction, and tension I've witnessed started on Friday. My constituents are asking what is going on here and how the heck did it all come to this? Canadians have faced emergencies and threats, plane bombings, lengthy armed standoffs, threats of terrorist attacks, 9/11, massive riots, critical infrastructure and mine bombings, prolonged biker gang wars, year-long housing development occupations, mass shootings, churches deliberately burned to the ground over several months, blockades on rail lines, ports, bridges and highways, some which lasted for more than a month, flooding, droughts and wildfires, and even the possibility of foreign invasion. Canadians came through each of these tests.
Interrupting the Honourable Member, but can we go down with the noise? I think it's actually outside the chamber, but it's becoming very, very noisy, and we can hardly hear the Honourable Member for Lakeland. Thank you. Please proceed.
Canadians came through each of these tests, all of them emergencies, many involving deaths, injuries, significant and expensive property damage, and major economic impacts without the legislation that is designed only for crises when there are no other options, which we debate with heavy hearts today. Canadians always unite to defend our safety and security without violating the rights and civil liberties so many of our relatives fought and died for, which define us as a country and are the bedrock of our peaceful, free democracy. Canada has been a beacon to the rest of the world for our respect of enshrined rights like free expression and peaceful assembly, and for our commitment to protect and defend them in the face of threats and emergencies. We look back on times when that balance tipped with shame and apologies. That beacon's light has dimmed during the last 6 years. Today, it's nearly extinguished by the actions of this Prime Minister. He's setting a dangerous and unwarranted precedent, evocative of the response of authoritarian regimes to dissidents, protests, or any opposition. The Prime Minister created this crisis from beginning to end. He called the marginalized 10% of Canadians who have chosen for the various and private reasons they have to not be vaccinated, quote, misogynist, racist, science deniers. He said Canadians who travel to Ottawa to demonstrate to ask for an end to government mandates and lockdowns are conspiracy theorists who hold unacceptable views. And his actions imply they're terrorists, which, by the way, must involve bombing, shootings, and kidnapping, as legally defined, none of which has happened in Ottawa in the past 3 weeks. Of all these fellow Canadians, he actually bemoaned that they take up space and asked, do we tolerate these people? Let me say I hope there's room for every Canadian to exist, to take up space, no matter their views on vaccines or any government policies, whether I agree with them or not. Whatever happened to respect, tolerance, and diversity, to resisting the tyranny of the majority? It's chilling to think a Prime Minister would wedge, divide, and stigmatize his fellow Canadians for his personal partisan purposes, but so he has done. And more than a few people from Lakeland have pointed out, that sure went from a fringe minority to an emergency in a hurry. It would almost be amusing if it weren't so grave. Let's remember what's going on here. 3 years in, with one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and untold government-caused harm to families, businesses, mental health, kids' learning progress, jobs, relationships, travel, after so much isolation, fear, stress, confusion, and restrictions for which there is inconsistent or no evidence of efficacy, this Liberal government refused to do what many developed countries have already done and most provinces are already doing, end increasingly pointless mandates. Conservatives simply asked for a plan to do so 2 weeks ago, and the Liberals said no. The Prime Minister attacked and then refused to meet or hear from Canadians with whom he disagrees. And he's imposed his heavy-handed will, despite the strong opposition of 7 provinces. The Emergencies Act was never designed nor intended to be used to limit the rights of Canadians who express opposition to government measures. I confess I do have trouble seeing how parked trucks, bouncy castles, a big daily barbecue and ball hockey, Canadian flags and singing and donations for the homeless in front of Parliament meet these criteria. The Emergencies Act requires threats to the security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Canada, including serious violence against persons or property, impediments to democracy, and a, quote, urgent, temporary, and critical situation that seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians that cannot be effectively dealt with by provinces or territories. Does this all add up? Well, the short answer is no. First, provincial governments and law enforcement already use and can use existing measures and tools to disperse protests and clear borders in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, at the Windsor-Detroit Bridge in Ontario, and in Alberta, where a group with firearms were disavowed by demonstrators and the mayor confirmed were not connected with them. This was all done through negotiation with law enforcement and, frankly, with common Canadian decency, all before the Emergencies Act. Second, we MPs have been coming right here to do our jobs in the literal seats of Canadian democracy every day for the last 3 weeks, except, oh right, on Friday, after the Emergencies Act was imposed. And third, the recent clearing of protesters from Ottawa on charges like mischief use existing laws, while even the lawyer who secured the injunction against honking with which truckers complied is against the Emergencies Act. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association puts a fine point on it, quote, this law creates a high and clear standard for good reason. It allows government to bypass ordinary democratic processes. Governments regularly deal with difficult situations and do so using powers granted to them by democratically elected representatives. Emergency legislation should not be normalized. It threatens our democracy and our civil liberties. The CCLA is taking the government to court over it. The impacts of the Emergencies Act are wide-ranging and severe and violate fundamental Canadian values. Regulations stipulate kids who've been hanging out happily as if at a carnival will not be allowed within 500 meters of their parents or guardians involved with protests. The Liberals evidently believe separating children from families or guardians is legitimate. Anyone who doesn't agree can get a $5,000 fine or 5 years in prison while Canada is under the Emergencies Act. The same penalties will apply to anyone who participates directly or who bring aid, such as food or fuel. As someone of Ojibwe descent, I thought by now we've agreed in Canada that it's morally repugnant and wrong for the government to separate children from their parents or guardians unless the adults are harming them, and how callous that Liberals are prepared to ensure those Canadians are deprived of food and fuel. Apparently pets are targeted too. The Emergencies Act enables freezing personal and business bank accounts of anyone directly or indirectly linked to the protests without a court order or due process. The rules will cover cryptocurrencies and crowdfunding platforms too. It's already happening to my constituents. One guy never came to Ottawa and donated $25. Another woman's business account is shut down. She says, it's devastating. We can't pay our employees or our bills. How will people live? We had no part, sent no money to the convoy. Our bank does not know when it will be up and running again. So much for localized, targeted action. Meanwhile, security and military experts actually say there are no suspicious activity or credible threats identified with any of the protest-related financial transactions, and the only rationale the government's shown are assertions from the CBC. That's truly shocking. The Emergencies Act is already violating rights to mobility, association, and assembly. Big fences are already keeping Canadians away from here, a building that's theirs, grounds that are theirs, the people's place, the very place of all where they ought to be able to express their views on government policies and law. Gatherings around legislative buildings and national monuments, public assembly other than lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent, much of which has now been criminalized retroactively, near critical infrastructure, official residences, government buildings, and war monuments are banned. Canadians cheering all of this on must really consider how they would view these measures if the cause was one they liked and if the government was one they didn't. If their perspective changes, the unjust moral implications are blindingly clear. Much has been said of Conservatives and law and order. Let me explain my view. I believe in the rule of law and in freedom. So I'm for individual rights, limited government, personal responsibility, and social cooperation. I'm against squashing dissent, authoritarian policies, tyranny even if it's popular, and using police to achieve these ends. The CCLA says protest is how people in a democracy express and share their political messages. Many protests are destructive. It's possible for protests to be both disruptive and peaceful and nonviolent. Disruptive protests, while often unlawful, can be the most effective way of raising awareness. Through history, countless wrongs have been lawful and justified by governments and citizens. Basic rights and freedoms have been illegal. It's never the side in favor of the invasive, unforgiving, unyielding power of the state and against the sovereignty and freedom of individuals over themselves and their lives that is right. One day, we'll be judged for this, and Conservatives will be on the right side. I hope every MP will be too.
Yeah.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, in one word, wow. You know, I think she should be recruiting Max Bernier to run for the Conservative Party. You know, we're seeing the extreme right. Yep. You want to talk about a speech? This member, I don't. What do you say? Does she support the rule of law?
No.
Listen to the comments that she puts on the record. It's almost as if she's patting on the back, saying the blockade was a wonderful thing. We should be encouraging these things to be taking place. Does the member and her Conservative colleagues not realize the damage that was caused, the hurt for people losing jobs? She wants to see children put up as barriers, Madam Speaker.
Right.
Incredible.
Right.
Does she support the People's Party? I couldn't believe the comments that are coming from Conservative members. My question is, seriously, do you support the rule of law?
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
So that is precisely the name-calling, extremist, inflammatory, frothing at the mouth, putting words in a person's mouth, painting with one big broad brush, and twisting the points that a person has made. That's exactly what has driven hundreds of thousands of Canadians to feel ignored, abandoned, insulted, attacked by elected representatives, by this Prime Minister, and by this government. And frankly, he should be ashamed of himself.
Questions and comments.